Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump into the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. It's how we keep the lights on. I said every week, I know everybody's probably sick of hearing it, but it really is the lifeline of the show. So if you can pop over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast and have a look at all the things we have on offer there. We are hopefully working on a new little show, myself and Mags, where we may or may not be reading through smutty Viking literature, which would be really fun. So let us know if you would like us to do that. But at the moment, you have the Q&A episode, which is the primary feature on there. It's a bumper to every episode that we do where we sit down with our guests and let the patrons ask some questions. And they're a lot of fun. There's always a lot of extra information in there. And at this point, there must be hundreds on the Patreon. So go and check it out. It starts from £3 a month. If you can't, then a 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcasts. And just tell someone about it. Tell them to listen. That'd be great. Really appreciate that. But let's get into today's show. It's a little bit of a heavy topic, but it's one that I know we will learn lots about, and I'm really excited. So firstly, I'm joined by my lovely co-host and in-house archaeologist, Mags Havgar.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Thank you for joining us. And our guest is reoccurring. It's Ben Raffield. Ben is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Uppsala University. He specializes in the archaeology of the Viking Age with a particular focus on conflict and social organization, captivity, slavery, and social inequality and cross-cultural interaction within transnational settings. All the really lovely, easygoing topics, Ben.
Rolls right off the tongue.
It does. I need to make that a bit more concise, don't I? It's slightly long-winded there, you know.
It works.
You should see some of the ones that people send us. They're like 3 paragraphs, and I'm like, I'm just going to cut this down to like
a sentence. Yeah, that'll do. Yeah. We don't need much, to be honest. Like,
my favorite is still probably Espen's, who was like, playing a guitar when I was 6 in a band, stopped band. Life was much easier, and then went, oh, actually, I forgot, I'm still in this other band. And that was his little bio he sent me, and I was like,
that was Espen Winter, right?
Yeah, and I'm like, I'm going to read that verbatim because that's brilliant. But Ben, thank you for coming back. We had a lot of lovely feedback from the first episode, so anybody who hasn't listened to that, go and do so. It's a lot of fun, a lot of good information. But today, we're going to talk about slavery.
The thing is, it is a really interesting topic to talk about, and I actually find myself often when I have talked about this or even taught about it, trying not to be kind of too enthusiastic, because it's a really interesting topic. But at the same time, you remember we're talking about human beings, as we always are when we talk about the past. But this one's a bit more loaded, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
100%.
It's such a triggering word. It feels like it's even more so today than maybe ever. It really is a kind of thing that people have an idea on. I don't know whether, because I feel like everybody has an idea of what slavery is, and I don't know whether that's a good place to start in terms of maybe outlaying what slavery in the Viking Age was, because maybe it isn't what people automatically think of.
Or maybe like what I was thinking about too, this would be like jumping off of your question, Dan, but kind of specifying it more. Like when you research and talk about slavery, what does that mean when you use that word for you in your research?
Well, as you say, I mean, we're talking about a topic that isn't. It's a practice that is an incredibly ancient practice, the practice of enslavement. Of course, it's something that has been practiced around the globe for thousands of years, continues to be practiced today. There's an estimate, I think the last estimate was about, the higher end is 50 million people live in a condition that we would define as enslavement today. So this is, and that's a number that's so large you can't actually get your head around it.
Nope.
Yeah, I feel like I heard somewhere that don't they estimate there's more people like in some form of slavery today than ever in human history. And we kind of think of slavery as being something of the past, don't we? That kind of was eradicated, sometime maybe 100 years ago, more.
No, indeed. And I mean, of course, in a way, it could be partially down to our definitions of, and this is your question, right? Our definitions of enslavement have maybe become more inclusive in the 20th century, and I think for good reason, in the interest of protecting people, protecting human beings. Of course, today, modern what we actually, you might term it as modern day slavery, can encompass not just the kind of what we might think of slavery in the ancient world, forced labor, the buying and selling of human beings. In the modern day, it constitutes forced marriage, human trafficking, kind of actually, when you again think back in terms of the historic and ancient world, actually practices that were socially acceptable. So, of course, our definitions, for good reason, have changed over time. But I mean, you ask, how do we define slavery during the Viking Age? And I think actually you could say that about any period. One scholar, actually, a prolific scholar of slavery, Suzanne Myers, actually argued it was one of the most misused words in the English language, because it's
interesting
in the sense that it's been used by so many people, by scholars, by government officials, by missionaries, by every day, people engage in everyday activities through their lives. We all have we have a tacit understanding, I think, set within our own lives, within our own environment that we grew up in, the way we were brought up to see the world and how we see the world today. We all have an understanding of what enslavement is. But of course, that can vary very much from person to person. But I think in terms of how we approach the subject from an academic perspective, as it were, I mean, if we're looking at the study of slavery in the past, we're very much guided by a view of enslavement, which is, I think, if you ask someone today, can you think of an example of a slaving system? Most people would say the transatlantic slave trade, and slavery in the U.S. And especially the southern U.S. prior to the Civil War, because that's kind of one of the archetypal, as we view it, slaving systems. People might also talk about slaving in the classical world, in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and really, I think what a lot of this comes down to is an idea of enslavement as ownership of people. And that's a legal question, actually. It's legal ownership of human bodies. But of course, when you kind of delve into the historiography and also kind of broaden one's views of studying enslavement globally, I mean, it can be many different things in many different places. It can be it can be a legal phenomenon. It's also an intrinsically social one. It's about personal relationships. It's about relationships within communities where people lie within a spectrum of inclusiveness and how that impacts their identity, the roles they fulfill within a community. It really is something that can branch out in all manner of ways. And this is a very long way of saying when you ask what was enslavement during the Viking Age. Well, this has been a topic of study for many years now. And when we approach slavery in the Viking Age, it's often, as I say, almost in the same way as we approach transatlantic and ancient slavery. It's viewed often as a legal phenomenon, and that's partly because we have medieval law codes. The earlier Scandinavian written law codes include quite a bit of legislation about people that we would describe as being enslaved, and it does come down to ownership of human beings. and the ability to inflict harm on them, to dispose of them in the way that you see fit. But the work, I think, especially in the last 20 years or so, of scholars such as Stefan Brink have really shown, as I say, it's more of a social phenomenon. And to understand it, you've got to kind of really get into the social structure and look at the household, look at the community. But in that way, it almost, I would argue, it defies a set definition. And when I talk about enslavement in my work, I will almost always, and it might seem very awkward, but I always talk about, for example, captives and enslaved people, because there are different distinctions between different social groups. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, as I say, this is a very unhelpful way of answering your question. And in fact, maybe I'm not even doing that.
I really kind of empathize with like kind of figuring it out as you're explaining it, because it's so complex. But to try to maybe simplify it a tad bit, like I know from an academic standpoint, I'm not doing you a solid right now, because I'm kind of asking you to be a tad bit more maybe
objective,
specific in a way that's difficult to do. But since you already mentioned, the transatlantic slave trade and slavery or enslavement and forced labor in the southern states of the U.S. pre-Civil War, and also ancient slavery in, for example, the Roman Empire. What is Viking slavery in comparison to U.S. slavery and Roman slavery?
I thank you for trying to bring me back down here. But again, the answer to that is I don't.
Do we know?
I think we know, but I think actually kind of part of what we do, and especially in archaeology, is we try to compare. Right, that's what the basis of especially archaeology is built on. You have a find from one place, you know what it is because you compare it to something from somewhere else. And we've tried, and in slavery studies, this is also something that you do. And in discussions of Viking age slavery, it's something that we have done. I think what we can say is that it's not like the transatlantic slave trade. It's not like ancient slavery. But I think that's because actually trying to come up with a universal definition of what this practice is, I would actually say, almost impossible, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Really.
But so how then is it not like the transatlantic slave trade or Roman slavery? I'm being really difficult here, Ben. I'm sorry.
Because this is important, and it's very difficult to find a starting place to talk about it. I think you can first talk in terms of scale, for example. Yep. What we do see quite clearly in the historical record, for example, from Western Europe, is we see Viking groups, we call them this, coming to places, engaging in raiding, taking people away, taking them captive. In some cases, selling them to other people, selling them into slavery perhaps, or taking them back to their own communities. This is compared to what we see in the early modern world, in the ancient world. This is relatively small scale. Even when we think about the kind of the well-known slaving, or relatively well-known slaving system in what is now Central and Eastern Europe, between the Baltic and the Khazars and the Volga Bulgars in Eastern Europe, who were middlemen in the kind of slave trade in the early medieval world. Even then, we're talking about kind of thousands of people a year, perhaps tens of thousands, maybe as well.
Yeah.
But nothing on the scale
not in
of
the
what
hundreds.
we're saying. No, later.
Yeah.
How does that work in terms of like a ratio to population? Because is it like a similar scale in that sense?
No, probably not. I mean, you're kind of you're asking the big questions at the beginning. The really big questions.
We're just grinding you down straight off.
No. So this is, again, it's something that is highly debated. And again, it comes back to fundamental ideas of what we constitute slaving systems to be. But to make it, this I can make very simple. If we're talking about Scandinavia, there's been arguments that people that we would describe as being enslaved, because there's a lot to that. What does it, as you said, what does it mean to be enslaved? And of course, that's a word that we applied to people in the past. But these people could range, it's been argued, from anything from about 2% of the population to 20. So it's a huge variation there. Mm-hmm. And there's absolutely no agreement on that, just to be clear.
Yeah. I mean, that would make sense also because we don't really know what the size of the population would be to begin with. Like, we don't have a full understanding of that either. So,
well, there is that too.
That makes sense in my brain anyway. Yeah.
But it could be anything. But again, I think it could be anything from, it's been suggested that, most average farms might have a few people who are enslaved or engaged in coerced labor. But at the other end of the scale, it's been suggested you have these kinds of sprawling estates with dozens and dozens of laborers, for example, working on them. But of course, that varies. That varies locally. It varies regionally.
What do we have to even go off when it comes to trying to figure out how many this kind of affected? Because obviously the transatlantic slave trade is so much closer to modern history that we have a much better idea of the amount of numbers. It's just better recorded, I guess.
And it's disgustingly well documented. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas we barely have any written sources for the myths or for pretty much anything from the Viking Age. So what can we even base this on? Is it literally just archaeological sites? And then I guess, how do you even know if someone's a slave? I know, and I think most people will have heard of the word thrall, which I think gets linked to a slave. Again, we'll probably
Let's put a pin on the thrall thing, because I have a specific question when it comes to terminology. But yes, go ahead, Dan.
But yeah, so is it that we're looking for that in saga literature and whatever else we can? How do we even find somebody that may have been enslaved without even looking at the different ways of being enslaved?
Well, I mean, and again, I mean, this is cross-culturally and in the literature, and especially in archaeological literature, you often see enslaved populations being described as invisible, because if we're to kind of really generalize here, we're talking about people who have perhaps no direct control over their or the ability to exercise autonomy over their movements and their roles. They might be limited in the ability to own property, or if they do own it, it can be removed from them at any point in time. They might live in marginal environments, even within a household. These people, they may not have quarters. They might sleep in the corner of a kitchen or of a room. So actually, I mean, in terms of material culture, we're looking for people who, as I say, have been described as being invisible. Now, we do see them, as I said, in written sources. Of course, we see them in the historical narrative. As I say, the written record of the Viking Age outside of Scandinavia, we see Viking groups coming, raiding, taking captives, taking them off to places, in some cases, selling them. But as you say, we're dealing with also a society that didn't produce their own written records. So that's why, as trying to come back to even trying to define it, the way traditionally to get to the slaving systems of the Viking Age is through the medieval law codes. So these are the Icelandic, the Norwegian law codes, first written down in the 12th to the 13th century, but which are...
So post-Viking Age.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But they're argued to perhaps preserve elements of oral legislation, law that was transmitted through people whose job it was to retain the law and to communicate it. But of course, then you don't know how old this legislation is when it's referring to. For example, is it something that's fossilized from an earlier period, or is it something actually later than the period that we're interested in? So it's an incredibly difficult task to get at even from the outset, because you have to deal with a hodgepodge of evidence that has major issues with it. In terms of historical bias, and issues of interpretation. And I think what I try to do when I've been working on this, and actually another point to highlight as well, is that when we do have even written sources, again, in societies, the slaveholding societies, these people are they're so unimportant that they don't even make it into the historical sources anyway. They could be ubiquitous, but you don't see them because they are so not worth writing about.
Just to kind of piggyback onto that, we did an episode with Marianne Moen, if you remember, Max, where we discussed the idea of human sacrifice, and I guess it kind of ties into this of, is it human sacrifice if you don't consider the people you're sacrificing to be people? And is that the case with this, that the slaves wouldn't be seen as human beings, or is it just that they're the lowest class of human? And is it even possible to see that differentiation?
Yeah, it's as everything else, it's a difficult question, and it's one that actually I think as well we have to bear in mind that there is no universal law. So let me put it, actually, to kind of answer this with like a hypothetical scenario. If you are someone who has gone off and you've participated in some kind of Viking activity, you've gone raiding, you've taken captives, you brought one home, you brought or several of these people home, and you're going to integrate them into your community. Some of these people end up as drudge laborers, doing the worst kinds of labor, really hard manual work. Some of them might end up actually being coerced into personal relationships with members of the community. Some of them might end up being marriage partners. So there's a whole scale of status. And even though these people might have, say you've taken a handful of these people and brought them back to your community, some of them might be integrated into your community in a way that they actually have some kind of they have some place and standing in the community, while others are pushed straight to the margins.
Would that depend on if you had a skill, I guess, to give, and the value of that skill? So if you could maybe translate off the top of my head, that might be seen as a skill. Or we can use that, but you can't kind of just put that person out for hard labor. They need to be close and held.
No, indeed. And I think that's part of it. But of course, with that, and as Marianne, maybe, from your conversation with her, but of course, those rules can also apply to people who aren't enslaved, or they're not captives, or they haven't been brought into the community. One's identity and roles and status, they're dependent on so many factors. It could come down to one's age, one's skills, one's sex, and all of these traits are active in different contexts and in different ways. So at the same time, when you talk about the kind of, the ritualized killing of people, whatever you want to call that, sacrifice, of course, some of these individuals might well have been normal members of the community even. Maybe they were just people who were selected to be, to participate in these acts in that way. They don't necessarily have to be dishonored. They don't have to be non-persons. One of the things I think we're kind of really showing in Viking studies at the moment is this idea of what constitutes a human and a human body, and a person, a social being. These ideas are all incredibly blurred in ways that kind of they really. I don't think they necessarily contrast with the ways that we view people and human beings today, but certainly they're ways that we haven't viewed people of the past as seeing each other before. The picture is becoming only more complex, and of course, the enslaved, whoever they are within this system of inclusion and exclusion from the community. And again, like trying to define that, it on one hand, it can't be done on an individual basis because we don't have that evidence. But at the same time, we acknowledge that we can't form a general rule. So you're kind of stuck between the rock and the hard place with this, which on one hand is what...
Yeah, it's a bit of like a catch-22.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, for me anyway, is actually not knowing.
But I mean, to continue with the complex, questions and kind of theorizing, I suppose, because I just remember growing up that we talked about just slavery as a concept, and it wasn't really problematized in any way, shape, or form, or really nuanced. And then especially when it came to the Viking Age, when we learned about that, the word thrall was, or the Norwegian equivalent today, was thrown around a lot and was pretty much just synonymous with a slave. But then I also find the at least to my knowledge, fairly recent, at least in popular culture, kind of discussion surrounding slavery versus enslavement and slave versus enslaved person to be really fascinating. So, because I noticed also too, I was kind of unsure when we started the intro questions what words to use, but then I also noticed you using enslavement and enslaved people before I even mentioned it, which I thought was really interesting. So I don't really know what my question is, but I'm just going like, terminology, thoughts?
Well, again, I mean, this is why there's no easy place to start from with this discussion, because actually what we're trying to do is also confront our own, so say this idea that we all have an idea of what to be enslaved is. And actually from the outset, we have to take our own perspective and filter the past through that and acknowledge that we see this in our own unique way. Because as you say, Mags, I mean, there is this common Scandinavian or this Old Norse term, trail, thrall, which is we find in the law codes, we find it in sagas, we find it in Eddic poetry. It's a term that we understand as referring to someone who has been enslaved or is enslaved. But even within, again, for example, the Norwegian law codes from the medieval period, there are some of these thralls are more human than others, or they have a different status to others. So again, this is what I'm very badly trying to explain earlier. It's an umbrella term that we use to conceptualize the identities of a whole range of people. And those people could be those who are born into a state of what we call enslavement. And that's the reason there is this kind of discussion about how do we talk about slaves or enslaved people. And the idea being that enslavement is something forced on people. It's not a natural condition. No one is actually born enslaved. It's something that is forced on you. And of course, for many people,
would you then say it's a society, like it's a social thing?
Well, I mean, of course, yeah. And it's a legal thing, and it's an economic thing. And of course, for many people throughout history, it's something that's, it's come through violence. It's been forced on you through violence. You've been removed from perhaps from your place of birth, taken somewhere else, and you've become this different person. So that's why I always find it better to use the term enslaved anyway, because even at a fundamental level, when a human being is born, they are not enslaved. That status is attributed to them by someone else. But as I say, I mean, so even when we're talking about, this kind of relatively well understood context of the legal codes, we have this term that can clearly relate to many people, but it's because it's our conceptualizations of enslavement are tacit. they vary. And so what we read in the law codes doesn't necessarily translate into practice in the community. Because even though someone is of a certain legal status, they can be treated in many different ways.
Do you mean to say that people don't always do exactly what the law says, and that the law is representative of how everyone acts all the time? Is that what you're telling us, Ben?
It seems to be that way, right?
What?
But no. But this is kind of it. It's why there's no ideal place to start with these discussions. I think actually this is why in my own work, actually, what I focus more on is actually the intersections of this practice and raiding activity. That's how I got into this. We had our podcast some weeks ago about warfare and raiding and conflict. That's how I got into this question, because as you say, Mags, it's something this practice is so widely associated with Viking activity. And what I always wondered was what is the deal with that? We read of these dozens or perhaps even hundreds of people being taken captive. What is happening to them? And that's kind of, I think you're in a better position there, because one, you have historical sources, which are always helpful. But two, you don't have to necessarily try and deal with these really complex questions that you started the conversation with.
Okay, in a raiding context, then is it always a case that these people are taken back to, say, Scandinavia, or would we see that when wintering in England again? I'm always very biased when it comes to the Viking Age of looking west to England, being an Englishman.
What?
Is it a case? Us English doing that? Is it a case of the when somebody's enslaved, they're kind of sent back to Scandinavia, or would they be kept within a wintering camp to just do the shitty jobs that nobody wants to do?
How complex do you want the answer to this question to be?
You can be as complex as you like, and then I can try to break it down if I feel like it.
No, okay, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad. So if you consult.
If I understand it, anybody else will understand it. So we'll go with
I meant
that.
more in terms of the wide-ranging possible answers to what you've asked. Okay. So what we can often just to really generalize, what we'll also often come across in historical sources is so and so number of Norsemen turned up somewhere, attacked the settlement, and 10, 20, 50, 100 people were taken off into captivity. Very often it doesn't go much further than that. But what we do see in a number of cases, and this is especially in Britain and Ireland, and in particular Ireland, what we see actually is a lot of people taken during these attacks, they're actually ransomed back to their communities. So that's why actually when in my work, I talk about captives and enslaved people, because people are taken into captivity. Enslavement isn't necessarily the final destination.
Right.
Okay.
So they're not synonymous.
No.
Being taken captive does not automatically make you an enslaved person.
So it feels as though, and this is such a probably reductive way to put it, and quite mean, I guess, when talking about people, but it seems as though it's what's going to make the most money or the best kind of just get all around gain the quickest. So if you can take somebody captive, ransom them back, make some money, they're out of your way, you don't have to feed them, you've just made some quick gold and silver. Or you take somebody and then, because if you enslave somebody, you do have to feed them, especially if you want them to work and do manual labor. They have to be fed and looked after to some degree. Yeah, it's not going to be nice, but there has to be some portion of rations and provisions given to them, and transport and moving them around.
Yeah,
it's a thing.
It's not reductive at all. You're talking in eminently practical terms, and this is how I think these groups had to think themselves. Of course, I mean, when we think about Viking raiding, one of the main objectives of this, as we view it, is the obtaining of wealth, portable wealth, silver, gold, perhaps commodities, things that they can sell, trade. And actually, you raise a really good point, Dan. To be honest, I mean, if you go to a place and you take 24 captives, you can get exactly the same outcome by selling them back to their families. And you don't have to, as you say, kind of, especially when you think about fleets operating in relatively small open ships, logistics is a problem. Feeding yourselves is a problem. So feeding extra mouths, certainly. So one of the things that we do actually see, and it's quite explicit in a number of cases, is this process of captives being taken back to a camp and then sold back, being ransomed. Generally, the people we read about in reference to this are high-end captives. They're members of the nobility, or the higher status members of society, high-ranking churchmen, and most other people we don't hear about. That is something that's important as well, because they're not important enough to be making into the history books. But so we have that, and as a practice in itself, we could talk about for a long time. But at the same time, there is also some evidence to suggest in at least a few cases that these fleets do take people and they sell them. In some cases, they take them to markets where they know they can get some kind of price for them, but presumably also they do take them back to their communities. But there is, as I say, so there's a kind of a scale as well of variable outcomes of this for the people who are subjected to this violence. And for some that will lead to enslavement, but certainly not all.
It sounds so cruel, but it is a simple economics thing, and it feels so unnatural to talk about human beings like that. But if we're going to talk about it, we kind of have to remove our modern kind of thoughts and kind of go back to that. And it is, I imagine the Vikings or the people who are capturing people they don't see it as being cruel or mean, because it's just they've seen it. Well, maybe they do see it as the cruel side of it. I'm sure they're not completely remiss to that, but it's a means to an end. It's that we want gold, and I imagine it kind of goes almost like a flow chart of the, it sounds awful talking about humans like this, but it's kind of like, are they wealthy enough to ransom back to their own people, and we can make some money right now? If yes, do it. If no, then maybe they're strong enough to take to a market, and we can sell them there where somebody else will pay us a good amount of money. Like, if yes, no, or do we need somebody who is strong enough? Then they can carry our stuff, but we already have 3 people who we consider strong enough to carry our stuff. So now anybody else is surplus. So we sell them on the market. Are we going to get money there? If no, then what other avenues is it? And it's kind of, I imagine it's that kind of mentality of like going down the options of the quickest way to make the money back. I imagine the least desired outcome is to put these people on a ship and take them all the way back to Scandinavia, because that does take effort.
It does, absolutely. But I think, and again, maybe given the kind of odd start to this, we might actually start tying some of these what seem like random threads together. I mean, because as you're saying here, I mean, again, if we're now to compare it to other slaving systems, including, say, the main one that we think of, the transatlantic trade, where you saw hundreds, thousands of people who were being commoditized. That's part of what made the transatlantic trade so vast and obscene, is you had the mass commoditization of human beings, where they were numbers in ledgers. How many can we fit onto a ship? How many can we get to make it to their destination alive? What will that mean for our profit?
It's like the status of like any sort of form of personhood was completely erased.
Exactly.
Like not even a factor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And let's not forget the end goal again in that case was still financial gain. It's who's going to work the best, get us the most money in the end.
And it's on a scale though that we cannot in a way comprehend, and I don't think actually to people at the time itself they could not, as they're doing this in some cases. But so what we're seeing in the context we're talking about now is actually, and I think you put this actually really, you kind of, as you say, like you say reductively, I think actually very, I think actually it was in a much more organized way than I could actually. But you see, these people engaged in this activity, they have their own concerns. But very often this kind of, this idea, you may see someone as being representative of economic value, but you don't necessarily see the same process of commoditization. Because there's so many potential ways of utilizing them for your own gain. They're not just cargo or cattle to throw into a ship and transport somewhere. There is a kind of, I think, in a way, an acknowledgement for the most part that there is an agency that you can harness yourself to get what you want out of these people. So with that, I think the way you put it, I think you're probably quite right. Is that the fate of these individuals would depend very much not just on their own personal traits, which may or may not be desirable to their captors, but also the goals of their captors themselves. And again, we try to kind of when we try to study Viking raiding and the processes that underpin this, we try and put it all in very neat boxes, and we forget that these people came from somewhere. They came with their own goals and their own objectives, which will inevitably have differed to the next group that came along. And again, it's acknowledging the variability, I think, actually in a way confuses the issue on one hand, but at the same time opens up this kind of really broad range of individual realities of what the past was, and these people's experiences of these attacks and these raids, and how those played out over time.
I think that's such an interesting point that you just made, because I gotta admit, that's one of the things that make me, for lack of a better term, stick with the Viking Age, in the sense that when, at least in my personal experience, I feel like when we talk about past societies and past cultures, not even that far removed for us in time, we like to talk about them as very systematic terms, and in very structured terms. Okay, in the Roman period, they did things this way, and then things changed, and then they did it that way, and it was kind of it's like a blanket, everyone did it this way type of thing. But even though we still I'm using the broad generalized we here, like to talk about the Viking Age this way, the Viking Age refuses to let itself be categorized that way, because it's so messy, I'm using heavy air quotes here, messy, in the sense that we have put this one cultural blanket term over these people in this specific area of this specific time frame, but they weren't one culture necessarily, and they all did things differently. Which I think was so interesting, the way that you said that, and the way that captivity and enslavement then worked would obviously completely vary based on whoever it was doing the capturing or enslaving.
Yeah.
There was no one set way of the Vikings captured this way, and they did it here and for these many people, then they sold this amount, then they took the rest back. It's no.
No, absolutely. And actually, partly what you come down to there is also a factor that we cannot necessarily get at, but is actually the relationship between the captor and the captive. And, that would also at some point come into play, because again, these aren't robots. You take a human being under your charge. There is communication. There is, there's no other word to use. There is a social relationship there, and of course, actually, that could also have a massive impact on the eventual fate of that person.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think we forget that everybody has feelings, even the big bad Vikings from 1,000 years ago. That if you, I feel like it would be easy to justify when it's a quick thing of like a few days or a week. When somebody's in your, they're in your care. Whether you even if you've enslaved somebody, they're still in your care. And you choose to either be nice or bad. But you have to care for.
Well, maybe you switch
person to a degree
throughout the day, whether or not you're nice.
Yeah.
And what does nice mean in this time period? And what does bad mean?
And again, I'm sure that some slavers were nicer than others. It's a spectrum. Some will have felt empathy more than others, and it's a case that the longest, I guess, I would assume anyway. But again, this could be me putting my own kind of feelings into it. That the longer somebody is in your care or as captive, the more you kind of feel for them and have some relationship that builds, and that kind of boundary probably blurs a little bit, I would guess.
I think it can, absolutely. And actually, we do also need to be, but at the same time, I'm the one who kind of put this out there, but at the same time, I'm going to also check myself. We also need to maybe not be aware that, of course, again, maybe this is our own biases coming through a bit. Because we have this, we innately see every person as an equal human being, which of course doesn't apply necessarily to people above.
Okay.
That's a fairly modern idea.
It could be, and actually, so as I say, that's kind of my fault because I brought this up. But that is an important point. But I think what you raised there, Dan, and building on your comment, Mags, is that actually if we talk more broadly in terms of enslavement, I mean, it's slave holding is a kind of, I see it as a sort of like a slightly schizophrenic practice. As you say, one day when you read accounts, and actually this is where I think some of the literature produced by formerly enslaved people, from the early modern period really comes into itself, is that you kind of get this personal insight into this condition. On one day being treated almost as a member of the family, on the next day being beaten bloody.
And that's also like an absolute headfuck for the slave. Because that's also a torture technique, isn't it? That they, countless places across the world have used, is that kind of switching from nice to shitty, and you don't know where you stand from day to day, and that has to kind of feed into it as well.
One of the kind of really prolific scholars in slavery studies, a sociologist, Orlando Patterson, produced some of the really outstanding works on enslavement, and he actually talks about the kind of the parasitic relationship between slaveholders and the enslaved, is that they depend on each other, but that relationship is so fraught, because the enslaved depend on or a captive depends on their captor for shelter, for food, for clothing, depending on how long they are with them. At the same time, the captor or the slaveholder depends on that other person, either, as a source of the ransom payment, or they need them to work in their household or produce food for them. And of course, that conflicts then though with this kind of this idea that you are, you're dealing with someone who you may or may not view as a full person or a full human being. And I think that partly is why you have this tension. And that, again, must have existed back in the Viking Age. I think it's why, again, this whole practice kind of eludes us in a way, or it's so good at eluding us.
Yeah, but I think that's such I think that's such an interesting point, because I feel like enslavement specifically very quickly forces us to grapple with how many concepts we kind of, at least in our part of the world, almost take for granted today in our current era, but grapple with, like, how recent are they? Is it possible for me to at all project this concept as being present or a part of the considerations of the time? But that not necessarily then meaning that these the people of that time were any kind of less intelligent or developed, but they just had a completely different understanding of the world and used different words and rationalizations for everything that happened compared to what we do.
No, indeed. Actually, something, a way I've tried to, when I try to conceptualize this very question, is actually and it's a hypothetical scenario, but if you take a woman who's been brought into a community as a captive and forced to marry someone within that community, which it is implied that did happen from saga literature and so on. What is the difference between this person and average, a woman within the community? At any rate, given that marriage is paid for in the Viking Age, you have marriage by bride price. So where the decision to get married doesn't necessarily lie within the woman's...
With the person getting married. Yeah.
What is the difference in status between those people? And how do you negotiate that?
Mm-hmm.
And again, that must have been an issue among communities.
Oh, absolutely. And I also, that to me immediately raises so many interesting questions of, like, cultural literacy or cultural knowledge, being like, I also then assume that a woman being brought from another culture, the status would then also depend on how able she would have been to adapt to the culture and read nuances. But then again, I'm speculating. I don't know. There might not be any difference between a local and, someone brought there against their own will from a different culture. But then again, who knows?
No, indeed.
But it's like, it's fun. But I understand what you mean, Ben, because it's fun going around in circles and then kind of continuously checking yourself, but being like, these are still interesting questions to pose, even though we might not be able to answer them.
No, indeed. But I think that's part of it, right? I mean, I was saying this a lot in our last conversation we had. I mean, you never get to the objective truth of any of this. But what you do find is that increasingly, every step you take into this, the past becomes more and more complex, and actually more in a way more like our own world today. We can see the same, our complexities of our modern world take a very different shape, but we often treat the past as a much more monolithic realm, and it wasn't. It absolutely was not.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting point when it comes to marriage, because I think we probably have or most people have like a warped view of the Viking Age as some sort of equality haven when it comes to, like, between men and women. Like, that's kind of put out there in...
No, I know what you mean.
In popular culture, that's kind of it's leaned into, isn't it? That everything was very equal. You have the strong female figures, whereas in reality, it wasn't quite as nice as that. So you probably do have in most marriages a case of where the man feels like he owns the woman to a degree, like him throughout most of human history, unfortunately. But would a man's ego be dented in a way if he was married to a slave versus a lady of standing? Would that make a difference?
Well, then now you kind of that's a good question, and one actually that deserves clarification. So, in our in a hypothetical scenario where that person who's brought into the community is actually sold into slavery, that becomes a different question. If you bring back a captive, and for example, if you bring back a female captive and you marry them into the household, they've never become enslaved.
Right.
But if there is some kind of social practice that changes their legal standing, that might well be a very different question. Because we see, again, if you take the early law codes as some kind of guide, you can see actually that an individual can purchase a thrall as a bedfellow, as a sexual companion. But there is a transaction there. That's because this person is owned by someone else. So that, I think, in the question you described there, then absolutely that may well bring with it social implications. But different ones, I think, than if someone is brought in as a captive, but someone who isn't recognized as being enslaved. And again, this is why when you come to your first question, what was an enslaved person in the Viking Age? It's impossible to answer.
Yeah, because from our standards today, a person who was brought in, maybe perhaps even against their will, primarily just to get married into the society, would still fit with a version of what we would consider to be straight up slavery.
Absolutely.
But then there would be the social distinction of like, you haven't existed in this society as with the label of an enslaved person for a period of time before maybe marrying this other person. But I also, this is a little
humans
bit
complex.
We're
just we make everything so complicated.
We really like to make a lot of like systems. We sure do. But I also wanted to just tack on to your earlier point, Dan, about like the sort of I would call it straight up misrepresentation of the Viking Age as some sort of gendered utopia. But perhaps not in the way, like my rebuttal isn't necessarily maybe in the way that most people expect when I say what I'm about to say, because I've caught some people by surprise with this a little bit. But what I think is really interesting is that, and this also fits with what you said earlier with captivity and enslavement, Ben, with like the past being a monolith, because I think also it's extremely difficult to just boil it down to, no, the Viking Age wasn't a gender utopia either, because to me that in itself makes it also sort of a monolith, because for me it is impossible to generalize that heavily without talking about social standing, because I also think gender wasn't a monolith in and of itself, but status and then gender. Then we can start talking about types of equalities or different inequality, but it would probably be more dependent on where you even were in the social kind of layered cake of the society.
Yeah.
But then being a man or woman wasn't primarily the thing that would decide what you could or could not do, but within whatever stratosphere, if you will, that you belong to, then your gender would maybe.
I think the best example of that is probably this idea that women could divorce their husbands. That sure, if you were a high-standing female, you could divorce your husband. But if you were just a low-standing kind of run-of-the-mill kind of, then no, that wasn't probably, or at least probably wasn't a thing. So it's that again. It's that you can't. It's not just that all women can divorce their husbands. It's that if you're an elite, then you can. Which it is that it's well, some things never change, do they? The elite can kind of do what the fuck they want, and so but it's status and then the other, and that's the same today, and I'm sure it has been throughout.
Sure, but I think it's
history.
I think we, at least from a Scandinavian viewpoint, I think maybe primarily Norwegian one from my perspective, we have this kind of sometimes like a false perception of like class and status not really being a thing anymore. And then the older you get, at least from my experience, the older you get, you're like, well, that sure ain't true. They're totally, but like they're a bit more ubiquitous, kind of hidden a little bit. Like they're maybe not as in your face, but this notion of your social standing being so critical for what you could or could not do, I think also ties really well in with how you classified captivity and enslavement earlier, Ben, because you like kind of maybe too long didn't read of this episode. It's like you can't say all slaves in the Viking Age equals or all men in the Viking Age equals or all women in the Viking Age equals. You have to kind of distinguish what area of the society, like what part of the society are we talking about, and then we can see if it's even possible to get into the nitty gritty.
I mean, yeah, this is it. I mean, I guess I could have given in the very beginning, so I could have given a really kind of stock answer that I don't actually believe. And that's, you know, because actually now class is coming, or what a term we use as class. Of course, we're talking about social strata here, but I mean, if you go to, I don't know, that Eddic poem, The Lay of Rig, you know, that anonymous poem possibly from the medieval period, possibly from the Viking Age, where the god Heimdall visits the houses of free families who represent different tiers of the Scandinavian hierarchy. The first one he visits is of the thralls, and they're described as the lowest of the low, performing these horrific menial tasks. The names that they're given in the poem, when they name the members of the household, they describe their kind of allusions to the deformities they have from their work, or their ugliness, their stupidity. So on one hand, you know, you could say that, you know, these people are the most, you know, the lowest standing members of the social hierarchy. But one, that doesn't tell you anything, and two, I don't think it's true.
It seems very neat.
It does.
It seems like a very neat way to describe it.
It is, but again, it also kind of aligns very well with our modern day conceptualization of what we consider social status to be. And I think actually, again, when you do try and consider the breadth of the sources, you see that actually some of these people, they're contradictorily, you know, they seem to wield the kind of influence within the household, within their community, that absolutely should not be available to what we might see as an enslaved person, and yet there they are. And then you start to follow it up, thinking about slavery in other historic and ancient societies, you know, and you think about the enslaved of the Roman imperial household. We had enslaved people employed in the highest positions within the administration, but they're still enslaved. But what does that mean in social terms? And this is really the kind of the questions we grapple with. But also then, as you say, Mags, it doesn't just apply to kind of socioeconomic groups. It applies to men, it applies to women, it applies to children and the elderly, those of perhaps different skill sets, levels of physical ability. And it's kind of, as I say, it complicates this notion of what it meant to be a member of society in a not very helpful way, but in an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like people of the past were just as complicated as we are today. Who'd have thought?
Yeah, it is that. It's almost as though all slaves in themselves aren't equal. And to put it back to, you know, the transatlantic slave trade that so many people will be familiar with. Again, you have people who would be in the field and then people who would be in the house. And there's a big distinction there because one is significantly better than the other. And so it's that idea of they're not they're both slaves. One is arguably better than the other, and I guess that's similar. You would have the similar kind of situations that the one is better, but it's not. But it's still slavery. It's still shitty, and just.
You asked the question as to why, if you're a Viking raider going overseas, why would you even bother to bring people back home when you could offload them probably a lot easier? You could either ransom them back or take them to some kind of market and sell them. Actually, maybe there is something to be had from bringing back an exotic individual from somewhere far away, and when they're in your household, or of course you can gift these people. You don't necessarily have to sell them. You can gift them to members of your retinue, to members of your social network, your political network, or actually just having them around. You have your you have your Irish captive serving you at dinner. That says something. There's
it makes me feel so icky, but I completely get what you mean, because my first thought then was, and it's kind of like that kind of light bulb thing of like, oh well, yeah, like if these people encountered an exotic animal, and it is that it feels uncomfortable making that comparison, but if they came across an exotic animal, same with with peacocks, they would take them back and be like, it's a show of status. So it's not a hard stretch to think that they would do the same thing with humans, as uncomfortable as it is to kind of comprehend.
And it's part of what feeds into the second really difficult question you asked was about the numbers game. And, you had these very varying estimates of how many enslaved people there were, or in some of the kind of the more minimalist figures are driven by these kinds of perceptions as well, in part at least, that, if you don't need these people for labor, which we may not have well done, we don't really, there's a lot to learn about the labor relations of the Viking Age. But if you don't necessarily need lots of enslaved or coerced labor, actually, maybe the primary use of these individuals was as a symbol of status, meaning you probably don't need that many around. They're actually, in there being relatively few of them, they have a higher value. So I am actually in purposely trying to bring some of these threads together now, because I'm hoping that there's a reason that this picture seems so complicated. But yeah, I think, as you say, actually the kind of tasks that one was engaged in, someone working within the household may have had a vastly different, they may have had on paper, as it were, the same status as the person out in the field digging up earth and moving logs. But that distinction of being indoors may have been a very important one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like the day-to-day reality of what the life would be like would be dramatically different.
Oh, yeah.
Potentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just, when you said, when you were talking about like the status markers, both of you guys, actually, again, this is completely speculative on my end, but I got this terrible kind of, what's it called? Kind of, oh, this sounds awful even in my head, but like tragically funny but awful scenario in my head of like someone pillaging like a monastery and seeing some sort of like illustrated manuscript or something and be like, oh, this is really cool. Did any of you guys make this? And then some poor monk just being like, oh yeah, that's fine. And be like, you're cool. Let's bring him back, guys. Mm-hmm. He does weird stuff with like parchment, like with vellum. We don't really necessarily need that, but he can do cool shit. Let's grab him. And this poor monk just being like, oh no.
Mm-hmm. But then the
I'm
alternative
not saying that
might
that
be
actually happened in the Viking Age, guys, but potentially.
the alternative could be though that he's just killed. So it's kind of, like say a rock or a hard place. In some cases, like, do you become a slave? Do you just get murdered on the spot? Which one's better? Is there, it's kind of, it's tough. I have a couple of questions left that I have. I might save one for the Q&A after. Yeah, I'm going to save one because I want to know whether we have any evidence of like entertainment aspect of slavery, as in kind of like a gladiatorial thing, whereas it's not really for work, it's for more entertaining the masses. So I want to put a pin in that. We'll come back to that in the Q&A. The other one was, do we? I guess my thought when it comes to slavery would be that maybe this is me thinking of humanity too much, that all humans have some empathy. And I believe that when it comes to slavery, there's always an aspect of making somebody another. We make you another, we separate that humanity, and then we justify it through that. So with the transatlantic slavery, it was obviously skin color. That was how we created this barrier. Well, I say we, not me, but humans created this barrier, and we're like, the skin color is the difference. Those people are different. They're not as smart as whatever justification they made. That was how they got around it. Kind of made it okay in their own eyes because they were seen as subhuman. Do we see that to any effect when it comes to the Viking? Is that, because again, my mind would go straight to Christianity. But is that me just kind of being too simple of going, oh, well, you have pagans, you have these Christians, they're going to go, you guys are Christians, you're not quite like us, so that's a way that we can say that you're less than we are. You're not the same as us, so it kind of allows that to happen, or does it not even matter?
Yeah,
did that make sense? I hope that made sense.
It does, and I think, I mean, this is a society where you do seem to have a kind of a domestic self-sustaining system of enslavement. So people are born into this condition. So the religious aspect might not necessarily come into that per se, but I think human beings have an amazing capacity to see difference and make it something. So, of course, in some contexts, it may have been perceived as such.
But it's not like, it doesn't seem like specific groups were necessarily targeted.
Not that I'm really aware of. And I think when we come back to this kind of these questions that we think of in more modern context of dehumanization and commodification of human beings, and this is just me, and I would never, actually, I'm saying it on a recorded podcast, but I wouldn't necessarily write it, but I suspect that we also try to reconcile ourselves with the capability of human beings' capability to do these things. Oh, they did it because they viewed them as different. They viewed them as not human beings. And of course, there is theoretically an element to that. But again, maybe just, being lucky enough as we are to grow up in the context we have and see human beings as equal and to have empathy for them. But I mean, I can't believe that these people were not able to see the humanity of the individuals they were doing this to. I personally can't believe that, but I have no way of backing it up.
So maybe it's a more modern way of looking at it and thinking, trying to find a reason to kind of understand it. Sorry, Max.
No, I was just going to say that, like, sure, you wouldn't necessarily have any way to prove it, but I think the closest we can get to like proving or arguing that exact point is if we use Great Britain and Ireland as examples, from the little that I know about this field, knowing that people were 100% captured and also enslaved from these various areas, but then also knowing that there were hubs of places where Vikings settled and integrated.
Yeah.
Of course, you would have to look at timelines specifically, but that tells me that there is the capability of seeing the humanity in people was definitely present. And I also think that that is a really important thing that you mentioned now, with like wanting to kind of rationalize it from a modern perspective, of like, oh, these people were able to do this because of the way that they thought, but we aren't able to do it. And then I just, to make it like uncomfortably personal and close to home, I just think about the way that people in my own community and people that I see online or on the news talk about certain groups of people, specifically immigrants. And I have absolutely no problem seeing that people would be able to enslave other people just based on implied or speculated differences that they deem subhuman or less worthy of personhood.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it was last year, wasn't it, where one small thing, I say small thing, somebody was killed, but something happened in the UK and suddenly sparked these riots across the country. And it's surprising how quick people, or some people, like show their colors when they think that there's a mob mentality, and they're kind of vindicated for it. And there was a lot of people who joined in that. I was, surprised at the amount of people and the spots that these things were happening. So, it's not something that's disappeared, unfortunately. I think, it's just kind of,
At all,
for the most part, pushed down because it's not maybe as socially acceptable. But as soon as it not becomes socially acceptable, as soon as they think that it does, they soon kind of fucking put their little heads up, don't they?
But I also think that, like, I just want to, like, one last point in that respect. I also think that it's important to remember that it's not just in those severe cases, but just the way that certain groups of people are casually described, or casually kind of like, oh no, I don't usually go to those types of shops, or I don't, like, if I hire help, I don't hire from those types of people. Like, there are elements of, I think, mentalities that are still very, very present, at least in the culture that I am from and that I have been in, the different cultures that I have lived in, that makes it absolutely possible for me to realize that we're not necessarily better today. We just have a different way of interacting with the world. So I see that could be possible. Unfortunately, it's a sad note to end this on, but
it is. I'm going to try and spin it back positive.
Okay, cool.
Because I feel like that's changed a lot in my lifetime. I feel like there are a lot of things that when I was a child I would hear and that were acceptable to, and again, it might be just a case that they were more acceptable to be said aloud then. People may still think it now, I don't know. But there were a lot of terms, particularly growing up in Yorkshire, which is very multicultural, that were used when I was a kid that you don't hear as much now. And if you do hear it, it really sticks and you kind of like, it jumps out. Whereas when I was a kid, it was kind of almost normalized. But whereas it really kind of, it's like almost like a little dagger now when you hear it. It really kind of makes you pick up and go,
it's
who
like,
the
what?
fuck said that? Yeah, so I think that it hopefully is shifting, but again, it could just be going underground. Who knows? But let's on that sad note, let's wrap this one up. Yeah, we'll ask some more in there.
It's been slightly difficult, hasn't it?
Yeah, because I was
but it's a difficult topic.
But
it shouldn't be an easy one to talk about, should it?
I have to admit that I'm actually I'm really relieved and happy that this was such a difficult episode, that we really struggled with like definitions and struggled with like even conceptualizing this and understanding it, because I think that's what this topic needs.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that we struggle with it.
It's made me go from because I had this very simple thought that it was the Vikings came to, like, say, I always look at England and Ireland but like wherever they went, they would take people to take them back, and they would work the farms. That was my idea of slavery, and this has really opened that to there are so many different levels to this, and even the terminology of what is enslaved or just captive, like it's so much more complex. And I have so many more questions from the episode, but that usually means that the episode has been good, because like anything with the Viking Age, I've done this long enough now where there are very few answers in this world.
Absolutely, indeed, and I think especially when you come to a topic as amorphous and elusive as slavery, it's we're talking about people who are very often, unfortunately, they are considered invisible, and actually to try and but I think to try and even sit and have these kind of discussions now, and giving that air, to actually put these people in our minds and to situate them in the past. I think that's an important thing to do, even if we can't quite get at them, to acknowledge their presence. And that they were there, they were members of communities, and they should not be overlooked in that sense.
There we go. Yeah, let's wrap up on that. We'll get some questions to you. To lighten the mood completely, my mother decided to join for the first time ever to this episode. I don't know why.
Hi,
this
Dan's
episode.
Mom.
Probably the last one to join on.
I get to do this and say hi, Mum, on the podcast, so that's quite fun. But Mags, where can people find you if they so choose?
When I am active online or post something once in a blue moon, you can find me on Instagram at Archeomags, Archeo with a K.
Perfect. Ben, what about you?
I'm not a social person, but no. But if anyone is interested, all I can say, if they want something more coherent than what I put to you today, almost everything I have written on this subject is open access. Anyone can read it. So if you want something a bit more concise and structured, you can just look up my name and find those works.
Can I also just say that I love that all of your all your research on enslavement is open access, and not because it would be horrifically ironic if that was behind a paywall.
It would actually,
in a certain sense.
Are they on academia?
There should be. I mean, if you just put in my name, I have a badly maintained WordPress site that has links to pretty much everything. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Wonderful. For me, it's Daniel_Farrand1, the business Horns of Odin, and the Nordic Mythology podcast across the board. Like I say, do go and check out our YouTube channel, hit the like and subscribe. And hopefully in the near future, we're going to be reading smutty literature. What's more fun than that? Ben, your face.
I kind of want to listen in on that one. But
all right. There we go. That's it.
We're trying to diversify.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Let's get out of here.